What happens when Hollywood's most uncompromising legend meets late-night television's most arrogant host? You won't believe what unfolds when Clint Eastwood sits down with Bill Maher for what was supposed to be a simple promotional appearance. The tension in the studio was palpable from the moment the cameras started rolling, and what followed was one of the most explosive confrontations in talk show history. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below, because you're not going to believe what unfolds when these two titans clash in the most heated exchange we've ever witnessed on live television. Last night's episode started like any other, with Bill Maher's signature smirk plastered across his face as he introduced his guest. But from the very first question, something felt off. The studio audience could sense the underlying tension as Maher leaned back in his chair with that condescending posture he's known for, ready to unleash his trademark brand of intellectual superiority on one of cinema's most respected figures. "So, Clint," Maher began, his voice dripping with that familiar tone of mock reverence, "you're here promoting your new film, but I have to ask about something more pressing. Your generation seems to have this romanticized view of America that frankly doesn't match reality anymore. Don't you think it's time to let go of these outdated cowboy fantasies?" The question hung in the air like a loaded gun. Eastwood's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but his voice remained steady as granite. "I think you might want to be careful about dismissing the values that built this country, Bill. Not everything old is outdated, and not everything new is an improvement." Maher's eyebrows shot up, clearly relishing the opportunity to pounce. "Oh, come on, Clint. You can't seriously believe that the America of your movies ever really existed. The whole strong, silent cowboy thing is just Hollywood mythology, isn't it? I mean, we're living in 2025, not 1875. You know what I think is mythology?" Eastwood replied, his famous squint narrowing. "The idea that experience doesn't matter, that wisdom comes from reading about life instead of living it. You sit behind this desk every night telling people how the world works, but when's the last time you actually built something with your hands?" The studio audience shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't the usual celebrity banter they were expecting. Maher's smile faltered for just a moment before he recovered, but there was something different in his eyes now, a flicker of genuine irritation. "Well, that's rich coming from someone who's made millions playing make-believe." Maher shot back, his tone becoming noticeably sharper. "At least I deal in facts and reality, not some nostalgic fever dream about the good old days that never actually existed for most Americans." Eastwood leaned forward slightly, his presence filling the space between them. "Facts? You want to talk about facts? Here's a fact for you. Respect used to mean something. Another fact, a man's word used to be his bond. But I guess those are just inconvenient truths in your world." The tension in the studio was becoming unbearable. Camera operators were adjusting their angles, sensing that something bigger was brewing. Maher's producers were likely having heart attacks in the control room, but the host himself seemed to be feeding off the confrontation. "Respect has to be earned, Clint," Maher said, his voice taking on that lecturing tone that had made him famous and infamous in equal measure. "And frankly, your generation's idea of respect was often just fear dressed up in politeness. Women respected their place. Minorities respected their place. Everyone knew their place and stayed there. Is that really what you're nostalgic for?" The accusation hit like a slap across the face. Eastwood's hands gripped the arms of his chair, and for a moment, the legendary actor looked like he might actually stand up and walk out right then and there. But instead, he did something even more unsettling. He smiled. It wasn't a warm smile, or even an amused one. It was the kind of smile that comes right before someone drops a truth bomb that changes everything. "You know, Bill," Eastwood said quietly, his voice carrying that dangerous calm that anyone who'd watched his movies would recognize, "I've been in this business for over 60 years. I've worked with every kind of person you can imagine: black, white, gay, straight, liberal, conservative. I've seen real courage and real cowardice. And I've learned to tell the difference between someone who fights for what they believe in and someone who just likes to hear themselves talk." Maher's face flushed red. The implication was clear. and it stung. Are you suggesting that I'm just talk? Because I've been fighting for progressive causes longer than you've been making movies about shooting people, cowboy. Fighting? Eastwood's voice rose just a notch, but in the silence of the studio, it sounded like thunder. You call sitting in an air-conditioned studio, making jokes about people you've never met fighting? You think tweeting your opinions to your echo chamber is some kind of brave stand? The host's trademark smirk had completely disappeared now, replaced by something much uglier. At least I'm not stuck in some fantasy where America was ever great for anyone other than straight white men. Your whole persona is built on a lie, Clint. The strong, silent type who solves problems with violence, that's not heroic. It's toxic masculinity. Something shifted in Eastwood's eyes. The gloves were coming off, and everyone in the studio could feel it. The legendary actor's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, but every word cut through the air like a blade. You want to talk about toxic? Eastwood said, his gaze never leaving Maher's face. How about a man who makes his living tearing down everything and everyone around him? How about someone who's so desperate to prove how smart he is that he can't see past his own ego? You don't build anything, Bill. You just tear down what better men have built. The studio was dead silent now. Even the audience seemed to be holding their breath, sensing that they were witnessing something unprecedented. Maher's face was a mask of barely controlled rage, but he was trying to maintain his composure, clinging to his image as the unflappable host who could handle any guest. Better men? Maher's voice cracked slightly. You mean men who solve their problems with guns and fists? Men who think might makes right? That's your definition of better? Eastwood stood up slowly, his full height making him tower over the seated host. The movement was deliberate, controlled, and absolutely intimidating. No, Bill. Better men are the ones who stand up for what's right, even when it's not popular. Better men are the ones who take responsibility for their actions instead of hiding behind a desk and a studio audience. The confrontation was reaching a boiling point, and everyone in the studio could feel that something was about to snap. Maher was trapped now, his usual escape routes of wit and sarcasm failing him in the face of Eastwood's raw, unfiltered honesty. The host was about to make a choice that would push this confrontation past the point of no return, and the legendary actor was ready for whatever came next. Maher's face contorted with a mixture of fury and desperation as he realized his usual tactics weren't working. The smug superiority that had carried him through thousands of interviews was crumbling under the weight of Eastwood's unwavering stare. Like a cornered animal, he decided to go for the jugular. You know what, Clint? Maher said, his voice rising to match his growing agitation. I think I know exactly what this is about. You're just another old white guy who can't handle the fact that the world has moved on without you. Your time is over, and you can't stand it. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. The studio audience gasped audibly, and even the camera operators seemed to freeze in shock. Eastwood's expression didn't change, but something dark and dangerous flickered behind his eyes. My time? Eastwood repeated slowly, his voice carrying the weight of decades in Hollywood. Son, I was making movies when you were still figuring out which end of a microphone to talk into. I've survived more changes in this business than you've had hot dinners, and I'm still here. But Maher wasn't backing down. If anything, the host seemed energized by the confrontation, feeding off the tension like a vampire drinking blood. Still here, sure, but relevant? When's the last time anyone under 30 watched one of your movies? You're a relic, Clint. A museum piece that occasionally gets dusted off for awards shows. The insult hit its mark, and for the first time in the interview, Eastwood's composure cracked just slightly. His jaw clenched, and his hands balled into fists at his sides. The legendary actor had faced down countless villains on screen, but this was different. This was personal. You want to talk about relevance? Eastwood said, his voice dropping to that dangerous whisper again. Let me tell you what's irrelevant. A man who makes his living mocking people who've actually accomplished something with their lives. You're nothing but a court jester, Bill. A professional heckler who wouldn't last 5 minutes in the real world. The audience was completely silent now, mesmerized by the verbal duel unfolding before them. Some were recording on their phones, sensing that they were witnessing television history. Others just sat transfixed, unable to look away from the train wreck happening in real time. Maher's face was flushed red now, his carefully maintained image of intellectual superiority completely shattered. Court jester? I'm a truth-teller, Clint. I'm the one willing to say what everyone else is thinking. And what everyone's thinking is that you're a dinosaur who can't accept that your brand of toxic masculinity is finally being called out. Toxic masculinity. Eastwood repeated the phrase like it left a bad taste in his mouth. Is that what you call it when a man stands up for himself? When he doesn't back down from a fight? When he takes responsibility for his actions instead of blaming everyone else? The host leaned forward aggressively, his professional demeanor completely abandoned. I call it what it is. Outdated, dangerous thinking that's caused more harm than good. Your whole generation confused being tough with being cruel, being strong with being silent. That's not heroism, that's emotional stunting. Something snapped in Eastwood's eyes. The legendary actor took a step closer to the desk, his presence filling the space between them like a storm cloud. You want to see emotional stunting? Look in the mirror, Bill. A grown man who makes his living tearing down everything and everyone around him because he's too weak to build anything himself. The studio felt like it was about to explode. Producers were frantically gesturing from the wings, trying to signal for a commercial break, but both men were too locked in their battle to notice. This had gone way beyond a simple interview disagreement. This was a full-scale war of ideologies. Maher stood up behind his desk, trying to match Eastwood's intimidating presence but falling short. Weak? I've been fighting for progressive causes my entire career. I've taken on politicians, religious leaders, corporate executives, people with real power. What have you done besides play cowboys and cops? I've built things, Eastwood said simply. I've created jobs, told stories that matter, worked with my hands. But more importantly, I've learned when to speak and when to listen. Something you never figured out. The host's face twisted with rage. Oh, spare me the wise old man routine. You're just another Hollywood hypocrite who made millions glorifying violence and then wants to lecture people about values. At least I'm honest about what I am. And what are you, Bill? Eastwood's voice was steel cold now. Because from where I'm standing, you look like a man who's never had to fight for anything real in his life. You've never had to make a hard choice, never had to sacrifice for someone else, never had to stand up when it actually mattered. The accusation cut deep, and everyone in the studio could see it. Maher's hands were shaking now, whether from anger or something else entirely. The mask of intellectual superiority had completely slipped, revealing something much more desperate underneath. You don't know anything about me, Maher shot back, his voice cracking with emotion. You don't know what I've sacrificed, what I've fought for. Just because I don't solve my problems with violence doesn't make me weak. Eastwood's smile was cold and predatory. Nobody said anything about violence, Bill, but the fact that your mind went there first tells me everything I need to know about you. You're so used to being the bully that you can't recognize when someone's just standing up to you. The words hit like a physical blow. Maher staggered back slightly, his face pale except for 2 spots of red high on his cheeks. The studio audience was watching in horrified fascination, unable to look away from the complete destruction of their host's carefully crafted persona. Bully? Maher's voice was barely above a whisper now. I'm not the bully here. I'm the one trying to drag this country kicking and screaming into the modern age, while people like you cling to the past. The past? Eastwood's voice rose for the first time, and it was like thunder rolling across the studio. You think honor is the past? You think integrity is outdated? You think standing up for what's right is some kind of relic? The confrontation had reached a fever pitch, and everyone in the studio could feel that something was about to break. Maher was backed into a corner, his usual wit and sarcasm completely useless against Eastwood's unrelenting assault. The host was about to make one final desperate play that would push this confrontation over the edge into something truly explosive. Maher's eyes darted around the studio like a trapped animal before settling back on Eastwood with renewed venom. His face was contorted with rage and desperation as he prepared to cross a line that could never be uncrossed. You want to talk about honor and integrity? Maher snarled, his voice rising to a shout. This coming from a man who abandoned his family multiple times, who cheated on his wives, who built his career on playing characters who solve everything with violence. You're nothing but a hypocrite, Clint. A fraud who's been living off his own mythology for decades. The studio went dead silent. Even the background hum of the cameras seemed to stop. The audience collectively held its breath, sensing that Maher had just detonated a nuclear bomb in the middle of the interview. But if the host thought he was going to get the reaction he wanted, he was sorely mistaken. Eastwood didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't even blink. Instead, he simply stared at Maher with those famous steel-gray eyes, and when he spoke, his voice was quieter than it had been all evening. You know what the difference is between us, Bill? Eastwood said, his tone so calm it was almost terrifying. I've made mistakes in my life. Real mistakes, with real consequences. And I've owned up to every single one of them. But you hide behind your desk and your studio audience, throwing stones at people who've actually lived. The host's face went pale as he realized his desperate gambit had backfired spectacularly. He had expected anger, maybe even violence. Instead, he was facing something far more dangerous, a man who had nothing left to prove and nothing left to lose. I don't hide from anything, Maher stammered, but his voice lacked conviction. I put myself out there every night, taking on the powerful, speaking truth to power. Eastwood's laugh was cold and bitter. Speaking truth to power? You are the power, Bill. You're part of the machine that chews people up and spits them out for entertainment. You think because you crack jokes about politicians that makes you some kind of rebel? You're just another talking head making money off other people's pain. The studio audience was transfixed, watching the complete and total destruction of their host's credibility in real time. Some were still recording. Others had their hands over their mouths in shock. The producers in the control room were frantically trying to cut to commercial, but the train wreck was too compelling to look away from. That's not true, Maher protested weakly. I fight for the little guy, for the underdog. I've always been on the side of the oppressed. The little guy, Eastwood's voice dripped with contempt. When's the last time you talked to a construction worker, Bill? A farmer? A soldier? A single mother working 2 jobs to put food on the table? You live in a bubble, surrounded by people who tell you how brilliant you are, and you mistake that for wisdom. The host was visibly shaking now, his carefully constructed persona crumbling like a house of cards. You don't know what you're talking about. I grew up working class. I understand struggle. You understood struggle 40 years ago, Eastwood shot back. Now you understand limousines, and private jets, and million-dollar contracts. You've become everything you used to mock, and you don't even see it. Maher's face was crimson now, sweat beading on his forehead despite the air conditioning. At least I'm not stuck in the past, dreaming about some golden age that never existed. At least I'm trying to make the world better. Better? Eastwood's voice rose slightly, and it was like a crack of lightning in the studio. You think tearing people down makes the world better? You think cynicism and contempt are improvements? You've spent your entire career convincing people that nothing is sacred, that everyone is corrupt, that hope is for fools. How is that making anything better? The words hit Maher like physical blows. He stumbled backward, his legs hitting his chair. For the first time in decades of television, the host was completely speechless. The man who had built his career on having the last word, on always being the smartest person in the room, had been reduced to silence by someone who understood the difference between intelligence and wisdom. You want to know what honor looks like? Eastwood continued, his voice steady and implacable. It's admitting when you're wrong. It's taking responsibility for your actions. It's building something instead of just tearing everything down. It's treating people with respect even when you disagree with them. The studio was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. Even the crew had stopped moving, mesmerized by the complete dismantling of their host's ego. Maher stood there, mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, unable to form a coherent response. I've made my share of mistakes, Eastwood said, his tone softening just slightly. But I've never made a career out of other people's failures. I've never hidden behind a desk and a microphone to avoid facing the consequences of my words, and I've never confused being clever with being wise. Maher finally found his voice, but it was barely a whisper. This interview is over. No, Eastwood said firmly. This interview was over the moment you decided to attack me personally instead of discussing ideas, but I'm not going to let you pretend that I'm the one who ended it. The legendary actor straightened his jacket and looked directly into the camera. Ladies and gentlemen, this is what happens when someone who's lived in the real world meets someone who's only lived in their own head. Take notes. With that, Eastwood turned and walked toward the studio exit, his footsteps echoing in the stunned silence. The camera operators instinctively followed him, capturing every moment of his dignified retreat. Behind him, Maher stood frozen behind his desk, his face a mask of humiliation and defeat. "Clint, wait!" Maher called out desperately. But the legendary actor didn't even slow down. As Eastwood reached the studio door, he paused and turned back one final time. "You know what your problem is, Bill? You've spent so long trying to be the smartest guy in the room that you forgot how to be a decent human being. That's not progress. That's just sad." The door slammed shut behind him with a finality that echoed through the studio like a gunshot. For several long moments, nobody moved. The audience sat in stunned silence. The crew stood frozen at their posts, and Maher remained behind his desk, looking like a man who had just watched his entire world collapse around him. Finally, a producer's voice crackled through the studio speakers. "And we're out." The spell was broken. The audience began to murmur among themselves. Phones came out as people started texting and posting about what they had just witnessed. The crew began to move again, but their movements were mechanical, automatic. Everyone knew they had just witnessed something unprecedented in television history. Maher sank into his chair, his face in his hands. The man who had built his career on being unflappable, on always having the last word, had been utterly and completely defeated by someone who understood that true strength comes from character, not cleverness. As the studio lights began to dim and the audience filed out, still buzzing with excitement and shock, one thing was clear. This wasn't just the end of an interview. It was the end of an era. The age of snark and cynicism had just been challenged by something far more powerful: authentic integrity. And for the first time in years, decency had won.